Mornings at the cafe always started the same way, too early, too chaotic, and with too much coffee that wasn't even for her. The scent of cinnamon rolls and espresso filled the small space, a cozy little corner of Boston that had been her entire world for the past 3 years. Clarice moved swiftly behind the counter, juggling a steaming pitcher of milk in one hand and a tray of croissants in the other, all while managing a line of impatient customers. "Mom, you forgot my apple juice," Ashley's small voice cut through the morning rush. Clarice turned to see her son standing behind the counter, his backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes still heavy with sleep. She reached over, pressing a quick kiss to his dark curls before grabbing a juice box from the fridge. "I didn't forget, buddy. I was just about to grab it," she lied. Ashley, wise beyond his years, squinted at her like he didn't quite believe it but took the juice anyway. Running a cafe and raising a child alone wasn't something she had ever planned. She had inherited the place from her grandmother, and despite the sleepless nights and the constant worry about finances, she had managed to keep it afloat. But barely. The repairs were piling up, the bills seemed to multiply overnight, and even though she loved her customers, she knew she couldn't keep this up forever. By the time the breakfast rush calmed, Clarice's apron was dusted with flour, and she was running purely on adrenaline. She collapsed onto a stool by the register, rubbing her temples just as the bell above the door jingled. Talia breezed in like she didn't have a care in the world, her hair sun-kissed from whatever exotic location she had just returned from. She was wearing some effortlessly chic travel outfit, the kind that screamed "I live out of a suitcase but make it fashion." "Clarice, we need to talk," Talia announced, sliding into the stool next to her. "That sounds serious," Clarice muttered, still massaging her temples. "It is. You need a break." Clarice snorted. "I'll rest when I'm dead." Talia ignored her. "I have a 2-week trip planned through Europe. Spain, France, and, get this, Aldebaran. You need to come with me." Clarice laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time all morning. "Talia, I have a 6-year-old. I run a cafe. I don't do spontaneous." "Exactly. That's the problem. You haven't taken a real break since Ashley was born. When's the last time you even left Boston?" Clarice didn't answer. She couldn't remember. Talia leaned in, eyes shining with excitement. "Come with me. Just 2 weeks. You deserve something that's just for you." Clarice glanced toward the kitchen, where Ashley was now perched on a stool, doodling on a napkin. She thought of the rent, the payroll, the never-ending list of things that needed to be done. "I can't." Talia sighed, clearly expecting this resistance. "Your mom already said she'd take Ashley." That got Clarice's attention. "You talked to my mom?" "She's on board. She thinks you need this as much as I do." Clarice's stomach twisted. Of course her mom would say that. How many times had she told Clarice to slow down, to stop carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders? Talia could see the crack forming in her resolve. "Come on. 2 weeks. No responsibilities. Just good food, beautiful places, and no one asking you for more syrup." It sounded ridiculous. It sounded impossible. It sounded nice. Later that night, after putting Ashley to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the open browser tab on her laptop. Flight details. Hotel reservations. She could say no. She could keep doing what she always did, putting herself last. Or she could do something that scared her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and before she could talk herself out of it, she hit confirm. Clarice had always thought of Europe in postcard images: cobblestone streets, flower boxes spilling over with bright geraniums, tiny cafes where time slowed just enough to make space for another cup of espresso. But Aldebaran wasn't just a postcard, it was a living, breathing fairy tale, somehow untouched by the rush of the modern world. The small kingdom was nestled between two larger countries, a place she had barely heard of before Talia convinced her to come. And yet, walking through the streets now, she felt like she had stepped into a world that had been waiting for her all along. Golden domes topped historic buildings, their details intricate, like something out of a storybook. The air smelled of freshly baked pastries and citrus, carried on a breeze that made the heat of the afternoon feel less oppressive. Musicians played on street corners, and the laughter of tourists mixed with the melodic hum of the Eldebran language, a language she didn't understand but somehow found beautiful. Talia was several steps ahead, camera in hand, spinning around dramatically in the middle of the square. "Tell me this isn't the most magical place you've ever seen," she called out. Clarice turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. "Okay, fine. It's kind of incredible." "Kind of?" Talia shot her a look. "You need to work on your enthusiasm." "I have enthusiasm. It's just buried under years of exhaustion." Talia looped an arm through hers and pulled her toward a row of market stalls. "Then let's fix that." Vendors called out in sing-song voices, selling fresh fruit, delicate lace scarves, handcrafted jewelry. Clarice ran her fingers over a silk scarf the color of the ocean, wondering if it was too indulgent to buy something just because it was beautiful. She was about to talk herself out of it when a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, miss?" She turned to see a man standing beside her, dressed far too sharply to be a tourist. He had a confident air, the kind of presence that suggested he was used to getting people's attention. His crisp navy blazer and pressed white shirt didn't quite match the laid-back market setting, and something about that made her instantly suspicious. Yes," she said cautiously. He smiled, the kind of smile that said, "I'm about to sell you something." "I couldn't help but notice you. You have a certain presence." Talia snorted, but the man ignored her. "I work in television," he continued, "and I think you would be perfect for a show we're casting." Clarice blinked. "Oh. Thanks, but I don't." He held up a hand, cutting her off. "It's not just any show. It's Choose the Next Princess." Talia let out an actual gasp. "No way." Clarice glanced between them. "Am I supposed to know what that is?" The man looked momentarily stunned, like she had just admitted she didn't know what Netflix was. "It's only the most talked about reality competition in Eldebran." "I don't live in Eldebran." He ignored that. "The premise is simple. Contestants go through a series of challenges designed to test their intelligence, charm, and grace under pressure. The winner, well, she becomes a princess." Clarice stared at him. "I'm sorry. What?" Talia practically vibrated with excitement. "It's a royal selection competition. Like The Bachelor, but with a literal prince. This is incredible." Clarice laughed, sure this had to be a joke. "You think I'm princess material?" The man gave her a once-over, his gaze thoughtful but not unkind. "You're not like the usual applicants. That's exactly why you'd stand out. And," he paused for effect, "there's a very generous cash prize just for participating." That caught her attention. "How generous?" The producer smiled. "Let's just say, enough to change your life." Talia grabbed Clarice's arm, her grip tight. "You have to do this." Clarice turned to her, exasperated. "This is ridiculous. I am not the kind of person who goes on reality TV. And I am definitely not princess material." Talia waved a hand. "No one is, until they suddenly are." Clarice sighed. The idea was absurd. But then, so was the thought of walking away from what could be a ridiculous but wild experience. And that money, that could mean a real future for Ashley, a cushion that might let her breathe for once in her life. She looked back at the producer. "You said there's a contract?" He reached into his bag and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Standard legal agreement. You compete, you get paid. If you win, well, you're bound by the terms, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Clarice took the contract hesitantly. This was insane. But what harm could it really do? Clarice let out a sharp laugh, the kind that escaped before she had the chance to filter it. A princess competition. A reality show princess competition. It was so absurd she almost wanted to thank the producer for giving her the most entertaining moment of her trip. She glanced at Talia, expecting her to share in the obvious joke of it all, but her best friend was staring at the contract like it held the meaning of life. You have to do this, Talia said, eyes wide. I really don't. But think about it. When will you ever get another chance to make a fool of myself on international television? Talia swatted her arm. No. To do something insane for once. Something just for you. The producer, who had been standing there patiently, seized the moment. It's not just for her, he said smoothly. Every contestant gets paid. Well paid. Clarice narrowed her eyes. Define well. He named a number. A number that made her actually stop breathing for a second. She had been expecting something small, maybe enough to cover a month of groceries, a short vacation. But this? This was life-changing money. This was money that could fix the cafe's plumbing, replace the ancient espresso machine, build a safety net she had never had. This was the kind of money that could give Ashley a future with choices. The producer must have sensed the shift in her posture because he leaned in slightly, voice casual, easy. Of course, the winner gets even more. But just competing? That alone would be enough to take care of a lot of things, wouldn't it? Clarice knew exactly what he was doing, and the worst part was that it was working. Her mind jumped to the cafe, to the bills stacked on the counter back home, to the way she always had to say not this month, baby, whenever Ashley saw a toy he wanted in a store. She had never been reckless, never taken risks. That wasn't what single moms did. But was it really reckless if all she had to do was smile, answer a few interview questions, maybe parade around in some designer dresses? It was a reality show. There would be cameras, producers, people in charge. This wasn't a trap, it was a job. A weird, ridiculous, high-paying job. She exhaled, trying to ignore the feeling in her gut telling her this was a very questionable decision. No one back home is ever going to see this, right? The producer flashed an easy smile. It airs in Aldebaran and a few surrounding countries, but no, your friends in Boston won't be tuning in. Talia was practically vibrating with excitement. You have to do it. Clarice pressed her lips together. If I say yes, you have to promise never to tell anyone back home. Talia mimed zipping her lips, locking them, and throwing away an invisible key. Clarice let out a deep breath. All right. Fine. I'll do it. The producer didn't hesitate. He pulled the contract from his sleek leather bag and placed it on the table in front of her. Just sign here, and we'll take care of everything else. The document was thick, pages upon pages of legal jargon. She scanned the first few lines but quickly realized she didn't have the patience to wade through all the clauses and fine print. There was no way they'd actually force someone into anything truly outrageous. This was a television show, not a binding royal decree. Without overthinking it, she grabbed the pen and scribbled her name at the bottom. Clarice had no idea what she was walking into. She had pictured something closer to a reality dating show, maybe a few group activities, some awkward icebreakers, a couple of cocktail parties. What she had not imagined was a sprawling estate that looked like it belonged in a historical drama. The estate's white stone facade glowed in the afternoon sun, with ivy climbing its walls and fountains dotting the perfectly trimmed gardens. It was the kind of place where important people sipped champagne and never spilled a drop. She stepped out of the car with the other contestants, adjusting the strap of her travel bag. A woman in a sleek gray suit greeted them with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her expression was that of someone who had no patience for nonsense. "Welcome to Chateau Aldebaran," she announced crisply. "You will be spending the next several weeks here. During this time, you will be evaluated on poise, intelligence, and leadership. You will be expected to adapt to royal customs. There will be eliminations, and at the end, only one of you will remain." Clarisse turned to the contestant next to her, a statuesque blonde who had the posture of someone born into wealth. "This is a lot more serious than I thought," Clarisse whispered. The blonde barely acknowledged her. A group of photographers snapped pictures as they walked toward the entrance, the sound of camera shutters filling the air. Inside, the estate was even grander. The floors gleamed with polished marble, and chandeliers hung from impossibly high ceilings. Staff members lined the hallway, bowing slightly as the women passed. In the main hall, 3 judges sat behind an ornate wooden table, their presence commanding. Duchess Miriam, perched in the center, was exactly what Clarisse imagined royalty to be: impeccable posture, silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, eyes sharp as glass. She wore a deep emerald gown that somehow looked effortless. Her expression did not suggest warmth. To her right, Prime Minister Alaric was watching the room with political precision. His suit was tailored to perfection, and he had the look of a man who had spent his entire life calculating how every move would play out in public perception. Lady Vanessa, seated on the other side of the Duchess, seemed the most approachable. She had a softness about her, with dark curls that framed her face and a kind but assessing gaze. Duchess Miriam was the one to speak first. "We are not here to entertain you. You are here to prove that you can uphold the expectations of this nation. Aldebaran is a kingdom of tradition, but it is also one that is looking toward the future. You will be tested in ways that may seem unfamiliar, but rest assured, they are necessary." Prime Minister Alaric nodded. "The public will be watching. Their opinions will shape this decision as much as ours. You must demonstrate that you are capable of not just fitting into this role, but excelling in it." Clarisse felt a flicker of something in her stomach. Was it nerves? Annoyance? What exactly had she gotten herself into? Lady Vanessa smiled slightly. "You will be provided training in etiquette, diplomacy, and public engagement. Some of you will adapt. Some of you will not. But do not mistake this process for a mere game. It is an opportunity." The contestants exchanged uncertain glances. Clarisse raised a hand halfway before realizing how absurd that was. This wasn't school. Lady Vanessa tilted her head. "Yes? So, just to clarify," Clarisse said carefully, "we're not meeting the prince at all?" There was a pause. Duchess Miriam's lips pressed into a firm line. "The prince is not participating in this phase of the selection," Prime Minister Alaric answered smoothly. Clarisse waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. The only images of the prince were the ones hanging in the hall, formal portraits of a man dressed in full royal regalia, his face always slightly turned, his features partially obscured. He could be anyone under that uniform. A staff member appeared to direct the contestants to their rooms. Clarisse followed, still trying to process everything. Their rooms were as lavish as the rest of the estate. Hers had a 4-poster bed, a view of the gardens, and a walk-in closet bigger than her entire kitchen back home. She sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples. She had signed up thinking this was just a reality show. A temporary adventure. Now, it was becoming clear that this was something else entirely. Clarisse had spent most of her life handling small-scale disasters. A shorted-out espresso machine during the morning rush, a sick employee calling out on the same day as a catering order, a 6-year-old who suddenly refused to eat anything but dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets. Those were the kinds of problems she knew how to solve. But sitting in a room filled with cameras, staring at a fake scandal printed in bold letters across a mock tabloid cover, she realized she had entered an entirely different universe. "Miss Williams," the moderator began, "could you explain this photo?" Clarice looked down at the glossy page. It was a picture of her leaving the estate at sunset, caught mid-step in what could easily be interpreted as a secret rendezvous. The accompanying headline was absurd: "Contestant caught sneaking away, secret lover or national betrayal?" She let out a breath. "I was going for a walk," she said. The moderator raised an eyebrow. "Alone?" "Yes. Alone. Unless you count the security detail who followed me at a respectful distance." Duchess Miriam, seated among the judges, gave a barely perceptible sigh. "Miss Williams, your response is defensive. A member of the royal family must always consider how their actions appear, not just their intent." Prime Minister Alaric leaned forward. "Try again. The press will not care about the truth. They care about the narrative. How do you redirect this?" Clarice glanced around. The other contestants sat beside her, waiting for their own turn to be grilled. Some looked confident, others pale. A few seemed delighted that she was going first, like they could learn from her mistakes. She straightened in her seat. "I appreciate that the public takes an interest in this competition, but I hope they also recognize that we are human beings. A walk is just a walk. Aldebaran is beautiful, and I wanted to see more of it. If anything, I hope this inspires people to visit and experience it for themselves." Lady Vanessa nodded in approval. The moderator, satisfied, moved on to the next contestant, whose scandal involved being seen laughing in a conversation with one of the estate's gardeners. The entire exercise was surreal. Later that afternoon, they were given their next challenge: hosting a charity event in one of the palace ballrooms, attended by real guests and donors. Clarice found herself partnered with the same contestant who had ignored her on day one, the blonde with perfect posture. Her name was Vivian, and she was clearly unimpressed with their assignment. "We should keep it simple," Clarice suggested, glancing over the list of requirements. "Introduce the cause, encourage donations, shake some hands. No need to reinvent the wheel." Vivian gave her a cool look. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes an event forgettable." Clarice bit back a sigh. "And what would you suggest?" Vivian flipped her hair over one shoulder. "An emotional angle. A compelling story. Something that makes people feel like their contribution will change lives." It wasn't a bad idea. Annoying that it came with an attitude, but still, not bad. They settled on a theme that emphasized Aldebaran's efforts in childhood education, highlighting personal success stories from the program they were fundraising for. When the guests arrived, Clarice found herself moving through the crowd with a practiced smile, shaking hands, making polite conversation. She was used to talking to people. She did it every day at her cafe. But these were wealthy people, the kind who could donate more money in one evening than she made in a year. One older woman, draped in pearls, peered at her with curiosity. "You're the American contestant, aren't you?" "I am," Clarice admitted. The woman sipped her champagne. "And how does an American barista end up here?" There was no malice in the question, just amusement. Clarice smiled. "I ask myself that every day." The event went smoothly, despite a minor disaster involving a spilled tray of hors d'oeuvres and an overenthusiastic violinist. By the time it ended, she was exhausted but relieved. Even Vivian grudgingly admitted, it wasn't a disaster. The next morning, they had etiquette training. Clarice had assumed this meant things like table manners, which she could handle. She had not anticipated walking practice. "Posture is everything," the instructor explained. "How you enter a room dictates how people perceive you. You must walk with intention." Clarice spent half an hour balancing a book on her head, which felt ridiculous, and the other half trying not to trip over her own feet in heels. The lesson on royal greetings was even more baffling. When meeting a foreign dignitary, the instructor said, never extend your hand first. If they extend theirs, a firm but not overbearing grip is acceptable. If they do not, a nod of acknowledgement suffices. Clarice raised a hand. What if they bow? That depends on their rank. And if I get it wrong? Duchess Miriam, who had entered the room at some point, said dryly, then you insult an entire nation. Fantastic, Clarice muttered. By the end of the day, her feet ached, her brain was overloaded with rules, and she had no idea how she was still in this competition. But when she finally collapsed onto her bed, she had to admit, against all logic, she was kind of enjoying it. Clarice had never thought of herself as someone who excelled under pressure. Her life had been a constant balancing act of making sure Ashley was fed, the cafe bills were paid, and that she didn't completely lose her mind in the process. But standing on the stage, microphone in hand, addressing a crowd of political figures, business leaders, and nobility, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. She was good at this. The challenge was simple in theory. Each contestant had to give a speech about modernizing Aldebaran's monarchy while still preserving its traditions. In practice, it was a tightrope walk. Say something too progressive, and the traditionalists would scoff. Say something too old-fashioned, and the public would roll their eyes. She had spent the night before pacing her room, rewriting her points over and over, throwing out anything that sounded like a cheap campaign slogan. She didn't want to be the person who repeated rehearsed phrases that meant nothing. Now, as she spoke, she saw Lady Vanessa watching her intently, a flicker of approval crossing her face. Prime Minister Alaric was nodding slightly, arms crossed, as though he were already envisioning how her words would play in the press. Duchess Miriam's expression didn't change. Clarice had been watching the Duchess throughout the competition, trying to figure out what it would take to impress her. Nothing seemed to do the trick. It wasn't just that the Duchess was traditional, there was something sharper beneath it, like she was waiting for Clarice to prove what she had believed from the beginning. That she didn't belong here. Clarice pushed the thought aside. She steadied herself and finished her speech, letting the applause wash over her. Later, she sat in the grand hall, watching the other contestants. The competition had started with 12 women. They were now down to 3. Vivian was seated across from her, poised as always. She hadn't stumbled once in the past few weeks. Her movements were graceful, her words polished. She spoke to the judges like she had grown up expecting to be in this position. Clarice wasn't sure how they had ended up as the last 2 standing. The announcement was made with dramatic flair. The final challenge would take place that evening, a royal engagement simulation. The 2 remaining contestants would attend a high-profile charity gala, mingling with Aldebaran's elite. It was their final test. Vivian barely reacted to the news. She simply smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her dress, as if this was an outcome she had always known was inevitable. Clarice, on the other hand, exhaled slowly. This was it. She was 1 step away from winning. And she still wasn't entirely sure what winning meant. Clarice stood at the podium, palms pressed against the cool surface, willing herself to stay composed. The room was packed, government officials, business elites, aristocrats sipping wine from delicate glasses, and cameras positioned at every angle. The chandeliers above cast a golden glow over the polished marble floors, the entire setting more intimidating than anything she had ever faced. She had been preparing for this moment for days, reworking her speech over and over, trying to find the balance between authenticity and diplomacy. Vivian had delivered hers with icy precision, every sentence crafted like she had been born to make it. Clarice wasn't going to compete with that. She had one advantage: she knew how to talk to people, not just at them. She took a slow breath, then began. Most of us think of royalty as something distant. A world we see in photographs, in history books, in movies. A world that feels untouchable. I used to think that too. Her voice was steady, even as she caught sight of Duchess Miriam's sharp gaze in the audience. Lady Vanessa sat beside her, hands folded, eyes bright with curiosity. Prime Minister Alaric was already nodding slightly, as if he knew exactly where she was going. But the truth is, being part of something greater than yourself is not just about tradition. It's about responsibility. It's about sacrifice. It's about waking up every day knowing that your actions are not just your own, that the choices you make ripple far beyond you. She paused, letting the words settle. In my life, sacrifice has meant making decisions that weren't always easy. Running a business when I wanted to rest. Taking care of my son when I was too exhausted to think. Choosing stability over excitement. And I know I'm not alone in that. Many people in Aldebaran, many people everywhere, live with those choices every day. The monarchy is no different. It must be built on duty, not just ceremony. It must serve, not just lead. She glanced at the audience, scanning their faces. Some were nodding. Others were skeptical. That was fine. She had never expected to change the minds of people who had been raised to believe that tradition was the only path forward. Aldebaran is changing, and its monarchy must change with it. A ruler is not just a figurehead. They are a reflection of the people they serve. And that means listening. That means evolving. That means understanding that duty is not about privilege, but about responsibility. She let her hands drop to her sides, her speech coming to an end. There was a moment of silence, the kind that stretched just long enough to make her stomach twist. Then, applause. It started with Lady Vanessa, a slow, deliberate clap that was quickly followed by Prime Minister Alaric. A few seconds later, the rest of the room joined in. Clarice exhaled, her fingers loosening against the podium. She had done it. The host stepped forward, smiling broadly. A truly remarkable speech. And now, the moment we've all been waiting for, the winner of Choose the Next Princess is. Clarice barely heard the rest. Her name was called. The applause grew louder. She was still processing it as the cameras flashed, as someone placed a sash over her shoulder, as Vivian gave a tight, diplomatic smile before turning away. She had won. She thought of Ashley. Of how this money would change everything. Of how, for once, she could breathe without worrying about next month's bills. She had no idea that this victory was nothing like what she had imagined. Clarice was still smiling when the envelope was placed in her hands. The weight of it was substantial, the paper thick and luxurious, the edges trimmed in gold. It looked like the kind of thing that held a royal proclamation or maybe an invitation to a palace gala. She assumed it was a symbolic gesture, something ceremonial before they handed her the check and sent her back to her real life. She slid her finger under the seal and pulled out the contents. At the top, in an elaborate script, were the words Certificate of Matrimony. Her brain stalled. She blinked at the paper, certain she had misread it. But no, there it was, in perfectly clear lettering. This document certifies the legal union of His Royal Highness Prince Rowan of Aldebaran and Miss Clarice Williams, validated by the laws of the Aldebaran monarchy, effective immediately. She let out a sharp laugh, the kind that escaped when something was so absurd it couldn't possibly be real. Very funny, she said, shaking her head. What is this? Some kind of dramatic reality show twist? The host, still beaming for the cameras, didn't blink. Not at all. This is what you signed up for. Clarice's stomach twisted. Excuse me? A producer stepped forward, his smile polite but firm, like someone who had explained this exact thing before and wasn't in the mood to do it again. It was in the contract. She let out a breath. No, it wasn't. He sighed, already reaching into a folder. It was. Clarice felt the cameras on her, the lights hot against her skin. The applause from the audience had faded into murmurs, but she could still feel the weight of all those eyes, watching her, waiting for her to play along. The producer flipped through the document and pointed to a section near the bottom. Clause 14b. The winner of Choose the Next Princess enters into an immediate and legally binding marital contract with the reigning Prince of Aldebaran. The room tilted slightly. She grabbed the papers and scanned the text, her pulse roaring in her ears. There it was, buried in a section she had skimmed over, disguised in language that made it seem less horrifying than it actually was. Her hands started to shake. "This isn't legal," she said, voice sharp. "I didn't agree to this. I agreed to a competition. I agreed to a prize." The producer didn't flinch. "And this is the prize." She looked at Lady Vanessa, then at Prime Minister Alaric, hoping for some kind of intervention, some indication that this was just another test, another challenge she was meant to navigate. But their faces were unreadable. Duchess Miriam, on the other hand, was watching her with something close to satisfaction. Clarice swallowed hard. "No. This isn't happening." Another producer stepped forward, speaking in the same careful, measured tone that people used when trying to calm an unruly animal. "Miss Williams, I understand this is unexpected, but this was never a game. Choose the Next Princess was designed as a modern selection process for the royal family. And as the winner, you are now." "No," she snapped. "I am not anything. I have a child. I have a life. You cannot be serious. The contract is binding under Aldebaran law." The words hit like a slap. Clarice's breath came faster, her vision narrowing on the wedding certificate still clutched in her fingers. It felt like a trick, like she was standing on a stage where everyone else had rehearsed the scene except her. The cameras were still rolling. Her skin prickled. She needed to get out. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she turned on her heel and bolted. Clarice had always considered herself a relatively rational person. She had handled emergencies before, broken cafe equipment, last-minute childcare disasters, a toddler with a stomach flu at 2 in the morning. She was not someone who panicked easily. But this was different. Her pulse was hammering in her ears, her breath coming too fast as the reality of the situation closed in around her. The contract was legally binding. She was, according to the law of Aldebaran, married to a man she had never met. And now there were men in uniform standing at the edge of the stage. The royal guards had appeared so silently that she hadn't even registered their arrival. They were dressed in deep navy with gold insignias on their sleeves, their posture rigid, their expressions unreadable. "This is insane," she muttered, gripping the edges of the wedding certificate as if she could crush it into dust. "This is actually insane." The lead guard stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Williams, His Majesty's orders are to escort you to the palace immediately." His Majesty. The word sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her. She turned sharply toward the producers, toward the judges, toward anyone who could make sense of this. "I'm not going anywhere. I didn't agree to this, Miss Williams," the producer interrupted smoothly, his smile still in place but his patience thinning. "This is not a debate. You are now a member of the royal family, and it is in your best interest to proceed with dignity." Dignity. As if she were the one acting unreasonable. Her breath hitched as she tried to process everything at once, the cameras still flashing, the murmurs from the audience, the expectant looks from the judges. They actually expected her to just go. "No," she said, shaking her head, stepping backward. "I need to leave. I need to talk to my lawyer." "You signed a contract, Miss Williams." Her fingers clenched around the papers. "Then I'll fight it. I don't care what your laws say, this isn't legal where I'm from." Duchess Miriam finally spoke, her tone like ice. "And yet, you are not where you're from." Clarice felt a tremor run through her legs. She needed air. She needed space. The room was closing in, the walls pressing against her, the chandeliers too bright, the noise too much. Her chest was too tight, her throat constricting, her hands numb. "Miss Williams?" She barely heard the guard. Her vision blurred at the edges. And then everything tilted sideways. The last thing she registered was the sound of someone calling her name before everything went black. She woke up in a bed that wasn't hers. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of lavender. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn, the hum of medical equipment nearby. It took her a moment to realize she wasn't alone. A woman in a crisp white uniform was standing by the door, watching her with professional detachment. "You're awake." Clarice swallowed, her throat dry. "Where?" "You fainted. The stress was too much for your system. The doctors say you're stable now." Stable. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling slowly, then exhaling through her nose. "You are in the Royal Medical Wing," the nurse continued. "The palace requested that you be monitored until you recovered." The palace. Her eyes snapped open again, and the weight of everything came crashing back. She wasn't free. She wasn't anywhere near free. Clarice woke up with a dull pounding in her skull and the disorienting sensation of being somewhere she absolutely should not be. The bed beneath her was too soft, the sheets crisp and perfumed, the faint beeping of medical monitors adding to the surreal atmosphere. The last thing she remembered was the wedding certificate, the crowd closing in, and then, nothing. She sat up too fast, her head swimming, her heart lurching back into a state of full-blown panic. The nurse, still stationed by the door, glanced up from a clipboard. "Miss Williams," she said, calm in a way that only made Clarice's nerves worse. "Take it slow." No. There was no time for slow. Clarice swung her legs over the side of the bed. "I need to leave." The nurse tilted her head slightly, as if she had been expecting this exact reaction. "That's not possible." Her breath hitched. "What do you mean, not possible?" The door opened before she could demand more information. A man in an expensive suit entered, followed closely by another official-looking figure, both carrying the energy of people who were about to deliver bad news they expected her to accept without argument. The first man clasped his hands in front of him, offering a diplomatic smile. "Miss Williams. I am Minister Quinton, head of the Royal Legal Office. I understand this has been overwhelming for you." Overwhelming. Overwhelming. What an interesting way to describe being tricked into an international marriage. She pushed herself to her feet. "I need to go home. Whatever ridiculous paperwork you have, I'm sure there's a way to undo it." The second man, shorter and balding, shifted uncomfortably. "I'm afraid that's not an option." "Why not?" Minister Quinton exhaled as if she had asked him to explain basic arithmetic. "Because the marriage has already been announced to the public." The words barely made sense. "What?" He gestured toward the television mounted on the far wall. The nurse picked up a remote, clicked a button, and suddenly, the room was filled with the sound of an actual news broadcast. Clarice turned just in time to see her own face on the screen, a polished anchor speaking over a perfectly edited montage of the Choose the Next Princess competition. The final clip was of her standing on the stage, caught in a moment of stunned disbelief. The royal family confirmed today that Prince Rowan is officially married to American contestant Clarice Williams, winner of the widely followed competition. The announcement has sparked excitement across Aldebaran and beyond, with discussions of what this means for the modern monarchy. She stopped listening. The room spun again, but she forced herself to stay upright. "This is a joke," she breathed. "You can't just tell an entire country that I'm married before I even agreed to it." Quinton didn't blink. "You did agree to it, Miss Williams. That is what the contract stated." She pressed a hand against her forehead, her skin cold despite the heat clawing its way up her spine. "You don't understand. I have a life back home. I have responsibilities. I have a son." The second official, the one who had been mostly silent, cleared his throat. "Yes. About that." Her stomach turned to stone. "We wanted to inform you that your son is being brought to Aldebaran as we speak. He will be here by morning." Her pulse nearly stopped. "What did you just say?" The man adjusted his tie. "Your mother was contacted earlier. We assured her that given your new status, your son should be here with you." Her breath caught in her throat, her mind a mess of panic and disbelief. "You took him," she whispered. "Of course not," Quentin said smoothly. "Your mother agreed that it was best for him to join you." Her entire body went cold. She snatched the phone from the nightstand, her fingers shaking as she dialed her mother's number. It barely rang before the familiar voice came through the other end, high-pitched and furious. "Clarice Marie Williams, what the hell is going on?" Her throat tightened. "Mom. I get a call from some royal assistant telling me my daughter is now married to a prince? And then they send a private jet for my grandson? Are you actually?" "Mom." Clarice squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the phone so hard her knuckles went white. "I swear to you, I didn't know. This wasn't what I signed up for." Her mother let out a sharp breath. "They told me you collapsed. I didn't know what else to do. They said it was safe for Ashley, that this was all happening with your consent." Her stomach twisted. Her mother's voice softened slightly, but the edge was still there. "Do you need me to call a lawyer?" Clarice inhaled through her nose, forcing herself to think. "I need to fix this. But I don't think fighting is the answer." A pause. "What does that mean?" She turned back toward the officials, their faces still frustratingly calm. "I need to talk to him. The prince. If he has any decency, he'll help me get out of this." Another pause. Her mother's voice dropped lower. "Clarice, don't let them push you into anything." Her fingers tightened around the phone. "I won't." She ended the call before she could break. Turning back to Quentin, she straightened her shoulders, summoning the version of herself who had fought for every dollar, every cafe customer, every single thing in her life that had never been handed to her. "I want a meeting with the prince." Quentin studied her carefully, then nodded. "You will have your audience in 2 days." 2 days. That was all she had to figure out how to convince a stranger to set her free. Clarice sat stiffly in the back of a sleek black car, staring out the window as the winding road led her toward a place she had no intention of staying. The palace loomed in the distance, framed against the blue Aldebaran sky, its stone walls glowing gold in the afternoon light. It looked exactly like something out of a fairy tale, which made sense, because fairy tales were absolute nonsense. The last 24 hours had been a blur of legal explanations she barely understood, press releases she hadn't authorized, and a growing realization that her life had spiraled into something unrecognizable. The only thing keeping her together was the knowledge that Ashley was arriving soon. Once he was safe, she could focus on her next move. The car pulled through the palace gates, rolling over gravel so pristine it looked as though someone hand-placed each stone. Rows of uniformed guards stood at attention, their polished boots clicking against the ground as they turned in perfect synchronization. It was all so precise, so choreographed, so impossibly royal. A woman in an elegant navy suit stepped forward as the car came to a stop. Her silver hair was twisted into a severe knot at the nape of her neck, and her expression suggested she hadn't been surprised by anything in decades. "Miss Williams," she greeted, her voice crisp. "Welcome to the Royal Palace of Aldebaran. I am Lady Celine, the chief advisor to His Majesty." Clarice exhaled slowly and nodded. "Great. So where's my—" Before we continue, Lady Celine interrupted, We have a schedule to follow." Of course they did. Clarice was ushered inside before she could protest, through massive doors carved with intricate designs, into a foyer that smelled faintly of fresh flowers and polished wood. Staff members lined the hallway, their movements effortless as they carried out whatever duties came with running a literal palace. She was given exactly 2 minutes to take in the grandeur before Lady Celine led her through a side corridor, where another woman, tall, with sharp cheekbones and a clipboard, was already waiting. "This is Mireille," Lady Celine said. "She will be overseeing your transformation." Clarice blinked. "I'm sorry, my what?" Mireille barely looked up from her clipboard. "You will need a wardrobe fitting, hair and makeup consultations, and a full etiquette refresher before tomorrow's press introduction." Clarice resisted the urge to rub her temples. "I don't need a makeover." "You do need to present yourself appropriately," Mireille said smoothly, finally meeting her eyes. "This is not a reality show anymore." There wasn't a single ounce of warmth in her tone, but Clarice couldn't argue with the truth of it. She was guided into a room that was somehow bigger than her entire apartment, its walls lined with racks of gowns in varying shades of ivory, gold, and muted blues. A small army of tailors descended upon her, measuring, pinning, adjusting, clucking their tongues at the fit of the dress she had arrived in. She stood there, arms outstretched, as they discussed her like she was a mannequin. "Her posture needs improvement," one of them murmured. "The shoulders could be more defined." "Hair down or up?" Mireille tapped her pen against the clipboard. "Down, for softness. We don't want her to appear too severe." Clarice sighed. "Oh, heaven forbid I appear severe." One of the tailors smirked. At least someone in this palace had a sense of humor. After what felt like an eternity of being poked, prodded, and generally treated like a living doll, she was led to an etiquette session in a room that smelled like old books and responsibility. A woman with perfectly coiled hair and a pinched expression introduced herself as Madame Odette. "You will be learning proper address, posture, and speech," she said, motioning for Clarice to sit at an absurdly long dining table. "We'll start with the basics. When presented to foreign dignitaries, you will." Clarice dropped into the chair and let her head fall back against the cushion. "This is unreal." Madame Odette's expression did not change. "Correct. This is royalty." By the time she was released from etiquette training, she had developed a headache and a lingering fear that she would curtsy incorrectly and accidentally offend an entire country. She was still rubbing her temples when she heard the sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the hall. And then, "Mom." She barely had time to turn before Ashley barreled into her, small arms wrapping tightly around her waist. Her breath caught as she dropped to her knees, hugging him fiercely. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, pressing a kiss to his temple, inhaling the familiar scent of shampoo and something impossibly him. Ashley pulled back just enough to look up at her, his brown eyes wide with excitement. "We're in a castle." She let out a small, breathless laugh. "Yeah, I noticed." A palace official cleared his throat, and she looked up to find an unfamiliar man standing a few feet away, hands folded neatly in front of him. "Your son's journey was smooth," he informed her. "The staff has arranged for his quarters to be." "Quarters?" Clarice repeated, eyebrows lifting. Ashley turned, his face lighting up. "I have my own room?" She swallowed hard, trying to keep her expression neutral. The official nodded. "Of course." His Majesty ensured that every comfort would be provided. Her jaw tightened at the mention of the prince. Ashley practically vibrated with excitement. "Mom, this place is huge. There are real guards and gold everywhere and a room just for desserts." "A dessert room," she repeated, nodding slowly. "Of course there is." She straightened, keeping one hand on Ashley's shoulder as she turned back to the official. "Thank you for making sure he arrived safely. I'd like some time alone with him now." The man inclined his head. Of course. If you need anything, a staff member will be stationed outside your door. Because of course they would. She led Ashley down the hall, ignoring the way the staff watched her like she was some kind of fragile artifact. The room they entered was more luxurious than anything she had ever stepped foot in. Plush sofas, towering windows, a bed that could fit an entire family. Ashley flopped onto the mattress immediately, sighing in delight. Mom, can we live here? She swallowed the lump in her throat and brushed his curls back from his forehead. We'll see, baby, she murmured. Because she didn't have the heart to tell him that she had no intention of staying. Clarice was already exhausted by the time Lady Celine informed her, in the same tone one might use to discuss weather patterns, that she would be meeting the prince at a grand banquet in 2 days. She was seated in a study, one of many rooms in the palace she was supposed to pretend felt normal, while a legal assistant droned on about the formalities of her position. Not that she had agreed to have a position. She was still holding on to the sliver of hope that this entire situation could be undone, that a serious conversation with the prince could clear up this mess. Lady Celine tapped a folder against the table. His Majesty will be in attendance at the diplomatic banquet on Friday. That will be your official introduction. Clarice blinked. Official introduction? Celine nodded. You will be presented to the court, as well as to visiting dignitaries. She straightened in her chair. That's not a meeting. That's a pageant. Celine did not flinch. It is protocol. Clarice exhaled through her nose. Is there any chance I could just talk to him before then? You know, like 2 normal adults? No. Fantastic, she muttered, rubbing her temples. She spent the next 2 days alternating between caring for Ashley, trying not to get lost in the palace corridors, and being prepped like a contestant in a real royal selection. The staff never stopped. There were fittings, etiquette refreshers, reminders about how to sit. Apparently, she had been sitting wrong her entire life. When the evening of the banquet arrived, she was stuffed into a sapphire-colored gown with a corset that was definitely a form of medieval torture. A hairdresser had worked her dark curls into something that required at least 30 pins and the cooperation of a small miracle to stay in place. Mireille, standing nearby with her ever-present clipboard, made a final assessment and nodded in approval. You'll do. Not exactly the confidence boost I was looking for, Clarice muttered. Confidence will not be necessary, Mireille said dryly. Just poise. Clarice barely had time to roll her eyes before she was being led through the grand halls toward the ballroom. The palace staff had outdone themselves. The banquet was a spectacle. Gilded chandeliers dripped with crystal, candlelight flickered off towering floral arrangements, and the air buzzed with the polished hum of conversation in multiple languages. Clarice stood at the entrance, trying to ignore the overwhelming scent of wealth and importance. Then the trumpet sounded. Her spine stiffened. The room fell silent. A herald stepped forward and announced, His Majesty, King Thaddeus. His Royal Highness, Prince Rowan. And then she saw him. Rowan entered the ballroom with the kind of presence that made the air shift. He was tall, with broad shoulders framed by a royal uniform of deep navy and gold. Metals glinted under the chandeliers, and his dark hair was neatly styled, not a single strand out of place. He looked exactly like the prince on the portraits. But those portraits had not captured the sharpness of his jawline or the effortless way he moved. Clarice had been expecting someone stiff and traditional, maybe even older. But this was infuriating. Because no one this good-looking should be involved in something this ridiculous. She waited for him to acknowledge her. A glance. A nod. A single flicker of recognition. But he didn't. He swept past her without a second look, his attention fixed ahead, his expression unreadable. The room exhaled, conversation picking back up. Clarice stood there, staring at his back, her irritation rising in real time. Are you kidding me? She muttered under her breath. This was going to be so much worse than she thought. Clarice had spent the entire banquet alternating between barely restrained fury and outright disbelief. It was one thing to be forced into this ridiculous arrangement, but it was another thing entirely to be ignored like she was just another piece of royal decor. She had expected Rowan to at least acknowledge her. A nod, a look, something. Instead, he had moved through the room like a seasoned diplomat, exchanging pleasantries, raising toasts, maintaining that unreadable, polished expression that probably made the monarchy's PR team very happy. Meanwhile, she had been paraded around, introduced to foreign dignitaries and titled guests who studied her like she was an experiment. Some had been polite, others curious. A few had clearly questioned what an American commoner was doing in their palace. By the time the evening ended, she had never been more certain of one thing: she did not belong here. She went to bed fuming. The knock at her door came early the next morning. She had been lying awake, staring at the ornate ceiling, trying to piece together a strategy that didn't involve flipping a table in front of the entire royal family. Lady Selene stood in the doorway, looking as composed as ever. "His Royal Highness will see you now." Clarice sat up too fast. "Now?" Selene arched a brow. "Would you prefer another public introduction?" Clarice threw the blankets off and stood. "Let's go." She was led through a maze of corridors, her irritation building with every step. She was not going to be ignored again. She was not going to let some prince, no matter how important he thought he was, treat her like she was insignificant. She was going to tell him exactly how this was going to go. And then she walked in. The room was not as grand as she expected. It was still insanely elegant, but compared to the rest of the palace, it felt understated. A sitting room with deep navy walls, a large fireplace, and bookshelves stacked with volumes that didn't look like they were just for show. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming the polished wood floors. And then there was him. He was standing by the window, hands clasped loosely in front of him, dressed in something almost casual, dark slacks, a crisp white shirt with the top button undone. No medals, no stiff formality. And he was gorgeous. She had seen him the night before, but this was different. This wasn't a portrait or a carefully curated public persona. This was him, and it was unfair how effortlessly regal he looked. Her plan, her very good, very logical plan, momentarily vanished. Rowan turned at the sound of the door closing behind her. His gaze met hers, sharp and assessing, like he was taking her in just as much as she was taking him in. She straightened, remembering exactly why she was here. "So, Your Highness," she said, folding her arms. "Care to explain why I was dragged across the world and tricked into an international marriage?" One corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly. "Miss Williams." His voice was smooth, like a man who was used to people listening when he spoke. "I assume you have questions," he continued. She let out a short laugh. "Oh, you assume?" Rowan stepped forward, measured but unhurried. "In my country, arranged marriages are common," he said. "For centuries, our families have chosen our partners." This was merely a modernized version of an old tradition. She blinked. "A TV show was your idea of a tradition?" He tilted his head slightly. "Would you have preferred something more formal?" She gaped at him. "I would have preferred not being tricked into legally binding matrimony." His lips twitched again, like he was resisting the urge to smile. "This was not a trick," he said. "Every contestant agreed to the terms." Her jaw tightened. "Every contestant didn't read the terms." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "That, Miss Williams, was your mistake." Her temper flared. "You think I'm the unreasonable one?" He studied her for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I think you're the most interesting thing to happen to this palace in a very long time." That threw her off completely. She was ready for condescension, for cold detachment, for more royal arrogance. She was not ready for this quiet amusement, this undeniable presence, this ridiculous handsomeness that made her stomach tighten in a way she absolutely did not want it to. And she really wasn't ready for what he said next. "I chose you," he said. "From the very beginning." Her breath caught. "What?" He nodded toward the fireplace, where a sleek tablet rested on a small table. "I was given access to the selection process. The producers presented candidates, and I reviewed their profiles before the competition began." She felt her pulse in her throat. "You knew about me?" He nodded once. She tried to process that. The idea that this very real prince, this impossibly polished, ridiculously put together man, had seen her and thought, yes. That one. "I had final say," he added, his voice quieter now. "And I was glad when you won." Her heart was pounding. "Why?" His gaze flickered over her, something unreadable in his expression. "Because I thought you might surprise me." For a long moment, she had no idea what to say. And that was the most frustrating part. She had come in ready to fight. Ready to demand an annulment. And instead, she stood there, utterly off balance, staring at a prince who was nothing like what she had imagined. Clarice stood there, arms crossed, trying very hard to pretend that she wasn't completely thrown by everything Rowan had just said. "You chose me," she repeated, like saying it out loud would somehow make it sound less absurd. Rowan remained perfectly composed, hands clasped behind his back, as if this was an entirely normal conversation and not a completely surreal disaster. "Yes." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's insane." His lips twitched, but his expression stayed carefully neutral. "Is it?" Yes," she shot back. "Because I didn't even know what I was signing up for." Meanwhile, you were apparently sitting in a castle somewhere, reviewing applicants like you were picking out a racehorse. His brows lifted slightly. "You think that's what I was doing?" "I have no idea what you were doing, Rowan," she said, the words sharp as she unfolded her arms and threw them in the air. "Because no one thought it would be a good idea to tell me anything before forcing me into an international marriage." He exhaled slowly, as if trying to keep his patience intact. "Would you like to sit down?" "No," she said immediately. "Something to drink?" "Also no." A hint of amusement flickered in his eyes, which only irritated her more. He leaned slightly against the edge of a nearby table, studying her in a way that made her feel far too seen. "I assume you have questions." "Oh, you assume?" His lips quirked again, but he simply gestured toward the chair across from him. She glared for a second longer, then sat, mostly so he wouldn't think he had won anything. Rowan steepled his fingers in front of him. "Would you like to hear how this all began?" She folded her arms again. "Would you like to hear how I ended up here completely against my will?" He ignored that. "In Eldebrun, arranged marriages have been the standard for centuries," he began. "They have always been decided by families. Political alliances. Practicality over emotion." Clarice scoffed. "Wow. Romantic." He lifted a brow. "They are effective." She opened her mouth to argue, but he continued before she could. "In recent years, however, public perception of the monarchy has shifted. Many believed we were outdated. That we were too removed from modern society. Some questioned whether we were even necessary anymore." "Can't imagine why," she muttered. His lips twitched again. "My advisors proposed a solution," he said. "A way to involve the people in the process. To let them see how a selection is made." She stared at him. "So you made a reality show?" He inclined his head slightly. "It was a compromise." She blinked. A compromise? Rowan nodded. Tradition, but with transparency. She threw her hands up. Okay, but how does this, she gestured between them wildly, make any sense? Because I was allowed to participate in the selection process, he said simply. She frowned. I thought you weren't involved. I was not allowed to interact with the contestants directly, he clarified. But I was given access to the early stages. The producers presented profiles. I watched the interview footage. Her stomach twisted slightly. You watched me? His gaze didn't waver. Yes. She let out a breath. That's creepy. That's deeply creepy. He actually smiled at that. It was necessary, he said. And I was pleased when you won. She narrowed her eyes. And why, exactly, were you so pleased? His expression shifted slightly, the humor fading just a little. Because you were different, he said. Her breath caught, but she forced herself to keep her face neutral. Rowan studied her for another long moment, then leaned forward slightly. And because you don't seem afraid of me. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to hold his gaze. She was very afraid. But not in the way he thought. Clarice had expected Rowan to be distant. Maybe arrogant. Maybe so burdened by royal tradition that he'd barely acknowledge her existence unless the cameras were on. What she had not expected was to sit across from him 3 days later, at a small table in the palace gardens, drinking coffee while he actually listened, to her complain about the absurdity of royal etiquette training. They expect me to memorize every title of every noble family that might possibly attend a banquet, she said, pushing her untouched croissant across the plate. Did you know there's an Earl of something or other who only attends state functions if the menu includes truffles? Rowan stirred his coffee, amused. Lord Montclair. Clarice pointed at him. See? That's a ridiculous thing to know. Possibly. He took a sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup. But if you make an effort to remember the small details about people, they tend to remember you in return. She huffed. That's unfair. You've been doing this your whole life. I, on the other hand, spent last week trying not to offend an entire country by sitting incorrectly. Rowan leaned back, a slow smile forming. You've improved. She rolled her eyes, but her stomach did an annoying little flip anyway. She was learning that Rowan was not what she had assumed. He was careful with his words, observant in a way that felt deliberate. He had a way of speaking that made her feel like she was the only person in the room, even when they were surrounded by palace staff. And when he laughed, which was rare, but worth it, he looked almost normal. Like a person, instead of an institution. Which was becoming a problem. Because if he were cold and detached, leaving would be easy. If he were unbearable, there wouldn't be anything pulling at her resolve. But he was none of those things. And he was amazing with Ashley. She noticed it immediately, the way Rowan didn't just humor him, he genuinely engaged with him. He asked questions that Ashley actually wanted to answer. He listened when Ashley excitedly talked about everything, the palace, the horses, the secret passage he was convinced existed somewhere behind the library. When Clarice walked into the palace courtyard one afternoon, she spotted them standing by the stables. Ashley was staring up at a huge, gleaming black horse with something between awe and hesitation. Rowan crouched beside him. He won't hurt you. Ashley glanced at him, skeptical. Are you sure? Rowan nodded. He's trained to be gentle. But if you don't want to ride, that's all right. Ashley hesitated, then looked back at the horse. He took a step forward, reaching out carefully, his fingers brushing against the horse's nose. His eyes lit up. Clarice swallowed, something tightening in her chest. Rowan had infinite patience with him. He treated him not as an obligation, but as a person, something she had rarely seen in men who weren't Ashley's teachers or her own father. And every time she saw it, leaving became a little bit harder. The days bled into one another in a blur of fittings, meetings, and endless training. Every morning, she was woken up early, dressed, and ushered into the next royal obligation. It was as if the palace itself was a well-oiled machine, and she was the last-minute addition that didn't quite fit. The preparations for the wedding were relentless, each detail more absurd than the last. There were discussions about flower arrangements, the color of the reception linens, the guest list that included dignitaries from countries she'd never even heard of. Every inch of her time was scheduled, and every moment that wasn't spent with royal advisors was spent worrying about what it would all mean once the ceremony was over. She had expected to feel something when she looked at her wedding dress. Maybe a sense of acceptance or the slightest thrill that this bizarre situation was finally coming to a head. But instead, when the seamstress handed it to her, a delicate thing made of lace and silk, in a shade of white she had no words for, she only felt a deep, gnawing anxiety. Clarice stared at herself in the mirror, the dress draped around her, feeling like she was wearing someone else's life. Someone else's role. Someone else's marriage. She was supposed to be in control. But here, surrounded by palace staff, foreign advisors, and never-ending protocols, she felt nothing but powerless. She hadn't even decided if she would go through with the wedding. But with every passing moment, it seemed like the decision wasn't really hers to make. The crown weighed heavily on her thoughts. No one had said it directly, but the unspoken truth hung in the air. The wedding was not about her choice. It was about them, the royal family, the public, the monarchy. And whether she liked it or not, she was already a part of it. She tugged at the delicate lace, feeling trapped by the dress, by the palace, by the whole situation. When she'd first arrived at the palace, she had imagined a life free from the constant pressure of survival, free from the exhaustion of juggling a business, a son, and an unpredictable future. But now, as she stood in front of yet another mirror, the weight of it all was suffocating. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, cutting through the silence. She grabbed it, eager for a distraction, her heart leaping when she saw her mother's name on the screen. "Mom," Clarice said, her voice hoarse as she tried to shake off the unease. "Clarice," her mother's voice was urgent, tinged with panic. "We need to talk. You need to come home." Clarice stepped away from the mirror, pacing in the small space of the room. "I can't just leave, Mom. It's not that simple." "Then you need to make it simple. This whole thing is a mess. How much longer are you going to let them make decisions for you? Your son is there with you. You have a life back here, real people who care about you." Clarice's heart twisted at the mention of Ashley. How had it come to this? When had her life slipped through her fingers like sand? "I'm just trying to." "Trying to what?" her mother interrupted. "To go through with this wedding? To become a princess?" Clarice exhaled slowly, feeling the tightness in her chest return. "Mom, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I want any of this. But Ashley. I don't know what's best for him either." She could practically hear her mother shaking her head through the phone. "Clarice, you are his mother. You make the decisions. You decide what's best for him. Not some prince." Clarice felt her frustration bubbling up. "I don't even know if I can make that decision, Mom. I don't know how any of this works. I'm just here." The silence stretched between them, the weight of it all hanging in the air. "Do you want to get married, Clarice?" her mother asked softly, after a long pause. "I don't know." "Then don't." Clarice clenched her eyes shut, letting the tears gather. She hadn't cried in weeks, not since she'd been thrust into this strange new world. But suddenly, the tears came, uncontrollable, spilling down her cheeks. She wiped them away angrily, annoyed at herself. She was supposed to be stronger than this. Her mother's voice softened. We can find a way out of this. You don't have to stay trapped there. If you want to come home, I'll be waiting. You don't owe anyone anything. Clarice took a deep, steadying breath. The thought of leaving, of walking away from the life she had stepped into, seemed both terrifying and liberating. But would it be right? Could she truly abandon it all? I'll figure it out, she said quietly, her throat tight. I'm here, honey. You don't have to do this alone. Her mother's words were a lifeline. But as she set the phone down, Clarice knew she couldn't go home, not yet. She had to face it. To confront what was really going on. She had to meet Rowan head-on and decide whether she could live with this future, or if she could walk away. Rowan. She hadn't seen him since the grand banquet. Since that cold, impersonal glance he'd thrown her way like she was just another piece of royal furniture to be moved around. But something had shifted. She had seen the softer side of him, caring for Ashley, listening to her complaints with patience. Still, it wasn't enough. She wasn't ready to face him yet. But she didn't have much time. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the wedding was creeping closer with every tick of the clock. She was trapped in a role she hadn't chosen. And there was no way out, not unless she found the courage to say no. The palace was quieter than usual. No hurried footsteps of staff, no distant murmurs of last-minute preparations. Just the sound of her own breath as she paced the length of her bedroom, fingers twisting the ring they had given her. It wasn't the wedding band, not yet, but it was the symbol of what tomorrow was supposed to be. What it wouldn't be. She had spent all day trying to convince herself that she could do this. That maybe it wouldn't be so bad, that maybe she could get used to it, that maybe Rowan wasn't the worst person to be tied to forever. But maybes weren't enough. Not for this. Her dress was hanging in the corner of the room, waiting. It had been fitted to her perfectly, down to the last pearl button. She hated how beautiful it was. How easy it would be to just step into it, let them fasten her in, walk down the aisle and let the world believe this was all meant to be. But she couldn't. She had to tell him. She took a breath and stepped into the hallway, her bare feet silent against the cool marble floors. She didn't need a guide to find his office. She had memorized the route without meaning to. When she reached the door, she hesitated. What if he fought her on this? What if he didn't let her go? No. Rowan wasn't that kind of man. She had spent enough time with him to know that much. She knocked. There was a pause, then his voice. Come in. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was sitting behind a heavy wooden desk, a single lamp casting a soft glow over a pile of documents in front of him. He looked up, his eyes scanning her face. Clarice, he said, setting down his pen. Is something wrong? She forced herself to hold his gaze. I can't do this, she said. The words felt heavier out loud. Like saying them made them real. Rowan didn't react at first. He studied her, as if giving her a chance to take it back. When she didn't, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. I see. That was it. No shock. No anger. She swallowed. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. His voice was even, unreadable. She had been bracing for an argument, for some impassioned speech about duty or honor. She had been expecting something. But he was just, sitting there. You're really not going to fight me on this? She asked. He shook his head. Would it change your mind if I did? She hesitated. No. Then why would I? She didn't have an answer to that. Rowan stood, rounding the desk until he was standing in front of her. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to change her mind. I'll make the arrangements, he said simply. Her stomach twisted. That's it? A flicker of something crossed his face. Disappointment. But not surprise. I told you from the beginning, he said. You are not a prisoner here. Her throat tightened. What about the wedding? I'll handle it. She exhaled slowly. She had been preparing for a fight, and somehow, his acceptance of it felt worse. She nodded. Thank you. Rowan gave a small nod in return, his expression guarded. You should rest, he said, voice quiet. You have a long journey ahead of you. She wanted to say something else. But there was nothing left to say. So she left. And this time, she wouldn't be coming back. Clarice zipped up her suitcase with hands that weren't quite steady. The room around her was still impossibly grand, still nothing like the life she had come from, but it had started to feel familiar in ways she hadn't expected. Ashley sat on the edge of the bed, arms crossed, his face twisted into something between heartbreak and betrayal. I don't want to leave, he said, voice thick with emotion. Clarice took a breath. I know, buddy. His small hands balled into fists. It's not fair. She crouched in front of him, brushing his curls back from his forehead. I know it feels that way. It is that way, he shot back. You always tell me to try new things. And we did, and I like it here. I don't want to go back. Her throat tightened. Ashley. He sniffed, blinking furiously, trying not to cry. Prince Rowan said I could learn to ride horses. Her stomach twisted. Emile said he was going to show me the secret kitchen where they make all the desserts, he continued, his voice cracking. And I like it here. Clarice felt something inside her crack. She had been so focused on herself, on her own panic, that she hadn't really thought about how much Ashley had settled in. This wasn't just her decision. It was his life, too. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. I love you, baby. No matter where we are. Ashley's voice was muffled against her shoulder. I love you too. But it didn't make it easier. Hours later, she stood in the palace gardens, watching as Ashley ran through the grass, chasing a butterfly like his entire world depended on it. The sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light over the carefully trimmed hedges, the stone pathways, the fountain where he had spent nearly an hour the other day tossing in pebbles just to watch them sink. The palace wasn't just a building. It was a life. And Rowan. She exhaled sharply. Rowan had let her go. No arguments, no manipulation, no last-minute attempt to make her stay. He had meant it when he said she wasn't a prisoner. And somehow, that had made leaving harder. A voice called her name. Lady Celine approached, her usual stoic expression slightly softened. You should see this. She gestured toward the palace entrance, where a row of televisions had been set up for staff to watch the press conference being broadcast across Aldebaran. Clarice walked over hesitantly. The moment the screen came into view, she felt her stomach drop. Rowan stood at the podium, dressed in his formal royal attire, his hands resting lightly against the lectern. The royal wedding, the reporter announced, was scheduled to take place this afternoon, but speculation has been mounting after an unexpected development. Clarice's pulse pounded. Rowan looked composed, but there was something else there, something barely contained. Then he spoke. I regret to inform the people of Aldebaran that there will be a change in plans. The crowd murmured. Clarice's heart slammed against her ribs. He was about to tell them. About to announce that she was leaving, that this entire situation had unraveled. Her legs moved before her brain did. She didn't know what she was doing until she was already halfway up the palace steps. She didn't know why she was doing it, only that she couldn't stand there and let it happen. The guards stepped aside as she pushed through, slipping into the side entrance of the ballroom where the press conference was being held. Rowan was mid-sentence when she appeared beside him. The crowd erupted. A wave of cheers and camera flashes filled the air, reporters scrambling to capture the moment. Rowan turned, his eyes widening slightly before he masked his shock. Clarice. She grabbed the microphone, heart hammering. She cleared her throat. I've made my decision. Silence. She turned to him, suddenly aware that her entire life hinged on the next few words. I'm staying. The roar of approval from the crowd was deafening. Rowan didn't move for a long moment, just watching her like he wasn't sure if she was real. Then, slowly, he smiled. The days that followed were a blur. Everything moved fast. The palace breathed relief, the wedding preparations resumed with an intensity that made the previous planning seem like a casual dinner party. The dress fittings, the etiquette lessons, the last-minute briefings on royal protocol all came rushing back, but this time, it didn't feel suffocating. Because she had chosen it. And Rowan. Rowan was different now. He met her where she was. He asked her opinion on things, checked in on her, listened when she expressed concerns about the massive shift in her life. She caught him with Ashley often, their bond growing stronger by the day. He had been patient before, but now, he seemed invested. And despite everything, she found herself leaning into it. The night before the wedding, she stood on the palace balcony, looking out over the kingdom that had somehow become hers. Rowan appeared beside her, silent for a moment. Are you ready? She turned to him. Are you? His lips twitched. I was ready the moment you walked onto that stage. She exhaled, the weight in her chest finally lifting. The wedding was nothing short of extraordinary. The streets of Aldebaran were packed, people cheering as the royal procession made its way through the city. Flowers rained from balconies, banners flew high, and the air buzzed with celebration. Clarice barely remembered walking down the aisle. It was all a blur of white silk, golden light, and him. Rowan stood at the altar, watching her, and this time, he wasn't unreadable. This time, she saw everything. The vows came, and she said them without hesitation. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, something settled inside her. She had fought this every step of the way. But standing there, her hand in his, she finally understood. This was exactly where she was meant to be.